On Monday evening, the house was quiet. The children were already asleep in their rooms at the far end of the hallway. Matt and Lynn were in bed, propped up against pillows. Matt was absorbed in a book about the Civil War. Lynn was focused on editing a marketing report. The room was filled with a peaceful silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of pages, the sound of Lynn's pen scratching on paper. Matt, feeling the weight of the words he had just read, closes the book with a quiet sigh. He turns onto his side to face Lynn, studying her with a mixture of affection and sadness. He always found it endearing how the tip of her tongue would peek out slightly when she was deep in thought, her pen hovering over the paper as she was absent. Lenny tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear and got completely engrossed in her work. Matt said, "Do you love him?" Lynn froze, her pen pausing mid-air. She couldn't bring herself to play the game of pretending she didn't know what he was talking about. Matt deserved the truth, or at least as much of it as she could. Lynn finally whispered, "Must or no?" Matt's voice was calm, but there was a quiet intensity behind it. "So it's just about sex." Lynn swallowed hard, trying to find the word. She struggled to meet his gaze, but eventually looked down at the papers in her lap. She admitted softly, "I think it's just about sex. Flirting, then sex." Matt stared at her in silence for a long moment. Then, with a steady voice, he said, "I think I would like you to sleep in." The guest room tonight. Lynn nodded, knowing there was no point in arguing. She slipped out of bed and found her slippers on the floor as she reached for her robe. Matt spoke again, his voice still calm but with an edge that made her heart sink. "Unless, of course, you slept with him in this bed. If you did, I'll never sleep in it again," Lynn said quickly, shaking her head. "I didn't do that," she wanted to ask. How could he think that? It was a bit much, but she knew it would sound ridiculous given the circumstances. Matt turned off the light on his nightstand and lay down, turning his back to her. Lynn stood there for a moment, her heart aching as she looked at him. His face was hidden in the darkness. Finally, she quietly left the room and closed the door softly behind her. On Friday evening, when Matt came home, the house was filled with the warm, inviting aroma of a home. He'd cooked a meal. He hung up his coat and was greeted by Lynn, who emerged from the kitchen with a tentative smile. She was wearing her best apron, the one she usually wore when they had dinner at the Frankel. She said, trying to keep her tone light and cheerful, "I decided to cook something nice for us tonight." Matt glanced into the dining room and saw that the table was set beautifully. There was a tablecloth, their best china, 2 of their finest wine glasses and silver napkin rings on the table. Candles flickered softly, adding the room had a romantic glow. Matt nodded, acknowledging her effort. "Smells good. I'll go wash up and be down in a few minutes." When he returned, Lynn was just bringing the food in from the kitchen. She carefully served each of them a portion of roast chicken, along with potatoes and green beans. A colorful salad with orange slices sat in a bowl nearby, adding a vibrant touch to the table. They sat down, and Lynn beamed at Matt. Though the tension was still evident on her face, it looked very nice. "It looks very nice," Matt said, his voice neutral. Then, without warning, he stood up and he climbed onto his chair, and Lynn watched, bewildered and then horrified, as he unbuttoned his pants and took out a bottle of liquid. He poured the liquid all over the table, soaking the chicken, potatoes, salad, and even the wine glasses. "Matt, what are you doing?" Lynn cried out, her voice trembling with disbelief. A lot of time, love, and effort had gone into it. Lynn was too stunned to respond. She could only stare at her husband, tears streaming down her cheeks as the weight of his words sank in. Matt gave her one last look, then turned and walked out of the house, leaving Lynn standing alone in the wreckage of what was meant to be a peaceful Sunday dinner. It was a bright, sunny Sunday afternoon, and Matt was raking leaves in the yard. Lynn approached him, her face a mixture of resolve and desperation. She was wearing a colorful autumn sweater that stood out against the muted colors of the fallen leaves. "I asked for a transfer," she said. Her voice was tentative. "I'm being transferred to the internal marketing department in a week. I wanted it to happen as soon as possible. I'll be in the building on Union Street, which is farther away from where I am now." Matt paused in his raking and turned to look at her. His expression was unreadable. "Why did you ask for a transfer? I thought you liked the international department." Lynn shifted uncomfortably. Her emotions were conflicting. "So I won't be near Douglas anymore. I won't be in the same office anymore." Matt's gaze hardened. "Why should that matter to me?" She looked both hurt and frustrated. "Because I won't be seeing him anymore. That's all I wanted you to know." Matt resumed his raking. His voice dripped with sarcasm. "Lynn, Matt told me it's over. And I believe him. Can you think of any reason why I wouldn't?" Lynn was getting frustrated. She stomped her foot slightly and her voice rose in anger. "Damn it, Matt. Do you really think your sarcasm is helping? Do you really think that moving out of that office will make everything better? There are lots of other men who would be happy to sleep with you until they forget their own names." Matt's voice grew louder, turning into a snarl, but he continued raking the leaves, his back turned to her. Lynn's anger quickly dissolved into sadness. Her voice broke as she said softly, "What else can I do? I'm trying everything I can, every way I know, to show you how sorry I am. I just want to somehow make amends for what I've done." Matt turned to her, his expression cold and unforgiving. "You think there's a way to make amends? Some magic formula, just the right words, actions, or gestures, and everything will be fixed. Lynn, you're living in a fantasy world." He turned away from her again and went back to raking, leaving Lynn standing there feeling more lost and helpless than ever. That Monday evening, Lynn was lying in the guest room when she heard the sound of small footsteps padding down the hall. Beth, who's almost 6, Lynn's daughter appeared in the doorway, her face drowsy and confused. "Mommy, why are you sleeping in the guest room?" she asked, her voice soft and lisping slightly. Lynn forced a smile and tried to keep her voice calm. "I stayed up late working, sweetheart, and I didn't want to disturb Daddy. Did you have a bad dream?" Beth nodded, her eyes still heavy with sleep, and climbed into bed with Lynn as Lynn held her daughter close. She could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her. She knew that the simple comfort she could offer her child was nothing compared to the solutions she needed for her marriage. Beth nodded solemnly, and Lynn got out of bed to sleep with her. "Come sleep with me, Betty and Big Bear," Lynn said gently, picking up her daughter and her teddy bear. She tucked Beth and Big Bear under the blanket and lay down beside them. Within 5 minutes, Beth was asleep. Once more, Lynn carefully picked up Beth and the teddy bear and took them back to Beth's room on her way back to the guest room. She paused and then changed direction, heading to the master bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and the room was dark. Lynn paused, searching for the right words. But before she could speak, she heard something unexpected. It was a sound of soft crying. Matt was quietly sobbing into his pillow. Lynn stood silently listening, then slowly she turned and walked back down the hall to the guest room. By Wednesday morning, each day became a little easier for Matt. Sitting in his office, he found it easier to concentrate on work, though his thoughts still wandered to painful places, but less frequently and for shorter periods. His secretary, Bernice, sensed that something was wrong, but she could tell he didn't want to talk about it, so she stopped asking and offered only sympathetic smiles at 10:50. Matt stood up, walked to his door and closed it. He took a dictionary from the bookshelf and placed it on his desk, flipping through the pages. He found the word he was searching for, cockled. Reading the definition aloud, he said, "A man with an unfaithful wife." He sat back down. "I am cockled," he said several times, feeling foreign. "On his tongue I've been cucked, she cockled at me." He sat there for a while, lost in thought, then with a heavy sigh, put the dictionary aside and got back to work on Saturday. Lynn sat in her friend Arlene's kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee. "For heaven's sake, Lynn, what on earth did you expect?" Arlene asked, tone sharp. Arlene didn't wait for an answer and carried on, sleeping with someone else behind Matt's back. Lynn flinched at the harshness of the word, but Arlene pressed on. "Now you're surprised he's angry and hurt?" Lynn shook her head. "I'm not surprised, Arlene. I just don't know how much he knows. We haven't really talked about it." "You think telling him it was only a few times would make a difference?" Lynn sighed deeply. "Not for me if it were the other way around. If he had slept with some other woman, even just 5 times, I'd still be torn apart. So no, I'm not surprised, not one bit. I just don't know what to do. I can't reach him, and I don't know what the hell to do," she said, her voice breaking as she stared down into her coffee, stirring it. Upset with a spoon while Irene watched her in silence. 3 weeks later on a Wednesday afternoon, Matt said firmly, "No," then softer, "No, I don't want her to tell me about it." The therapist, Dr. Isabel Harshman, frowned slightly. She had short dark hair styled almost like a Beatles cut and wore a brown corduroy sweater. "Don't you think it might help both of you to understand why Lynn did what she did?" she asked. Harshman asked Matt, who didn't even glance at his wife, who sat beside him. It might help Lynn to get it off her chest, but I don't see how it can help me, honestly. Dr. Harshman, I feel like I'm already suffering enough. Lynn hesitated before speaking softly. I thought that if I told you about it, how it happened and why, then you would understand that I could never do anything like that again. Matt turned to look at her directly. For the first time, do you really believe that there's anything you can say that will restore my trust in you, Lynn? That will make me feel like I don't have to worry for the rest of my life wondering when you'll jump into bed with another man? Lynn looked down at her lap, her voice barely above a whisper. No, Matt. I don't think there's anything I can say that will do that. 2 months later, on a Thursday evening, Lynn smiled at Matt, squeezing his hand across the table. It's so beautiful here, she said, her eyes shining. They were sitting on a veranda overlooking the Caribbean. The air was warm, and the last hues of the sunset lingered in the sky between them. On the table was a picture of sangria and a plate of grilled shrimp. Beautiful, isn't it? Lynn said again. Matt smiled back, but his eyes didn't quite meet hers. There was tension in his face, especially around his eyes. He squeezed her hand for a moment, then picked up his fork to spear another shrimp. Thank you so much for agreeing to come south with me, Lynn said. She knew it was hard for him to hold her gaze for long. His head and Lynn were snuggled against him with her head resting on his chest. It was wonderful, baby, she murmured in a low, relaxed voice. Matt reached down to gently stroke her back. She seemed almost asleep, but then she lifted her head to look at him. It's not that I don't enjoy it, she giggled, trying to lighten the mood. But lately it seems like every time we're intimate, you always come from behind. She asked playfully, make me your girl? Matt's expression grew serious as he sighed deeply. When we have sex, I watch your face, and I can't stop seeing you with him, imagining you looking at him the same way. He didn't finish the sentence. They lay still for a moment, the air between them heavy. Lynn suddenly felt a chill. A few minutes later, Matt got up, put on shorts and a t-shirt. He put on a shirt and left the room quietly. 5 weeks later, on a quiet Sunday evening, Lynn and Matt found themselves in the same room but on opposite sides. The air between them was thick with unspoken words as they busied themselves with different tasks. Lynn was sorting through their collection of CDs. While Matt stood in front of the bookshelf organizing books, the silence was only broken by the rustling of pages and the soft clinking of CD cases. Matt suddenly asked, should I keep the Dickens novels? I've read them all. Lynn still focused on her task and replied, it's up to you. Take them if you want. I'll never read them. As she kept on sorting, she put Matt's CDs in a small pile next to her. Then, almost without realizing it, she looked at him. She could see the muscles moving under his tank top. Each movement was smooth and precise. It was all so familiar. The familiarity made her eyes tear up. In a quiet voice, she said, you know this isn't what I want. I never wanted this. Matt stopped and the weight of her words hung in the air. He didn't turn around or say anything. They both knew what he would have said if he had. Instead, he went back to organizing the books, letting the silence fill the air, waiting for his unspoken response. 7 weeks later, on a Saturday evening, Lynn's home was filled with the joyful shouts of her children. Mummy, Mummy! Beth and Jason cried as they jumped out of Matt's car and ran towards her, leaving their overnight bags scattered on the ground. They clung to her, talking over each other. The kids were eager to share stories of their day at the zoo. Beth gushed about the giraffes, their long necks towering above her, while Jason exclaimed about the giant tortoises and the cotton candy Dad had bought them. After a quick greeting, the kids rushed into the living room and turned on the TV. On second thought, Matt walked up to the house carrying the bags they had left behind. Lynn returned and smiled. It seemed like they enjoyed the zoo. I still couldn't tell if they were thrilled or terrified. Matt chuckled. We got really close to the giraffes. They were towering over the wall. The kids loved the giant tortoises too. It was a good day. They chatted briefly before Lynn offered, would you like to come in for a cup of coffee? Matt hesitated, sensing the awkwardness between them. No thanks. I really should get going, he said, his smile faltering. See you Wednesday evening, she added, as he turned to leave. Lynn stood at the door watching as Matt's car drove away. She kept her eyes on it until it reached the end of the street, turned left, and disappeared from view. Months later, on a Monday evening, the house was filled with the quiet hum of normality. Beth was at the kitchen table, deeply focused on her coloring, while Lynn moved around the kitchen preparing dinner. Jason, sprawled out on the floor, was busy assembling his favorite wooden jigsaw puzzle, a colorful clown he had completed countless times before. Suddenly, Beth broke the silence. "Mummy, our friends." She looked up at Lynn, waiting for an answer. Lynn paused, turning to face her daughter. "I don't know, dear. What do you mean?" Beth wrinkled her nose and thought, "Well, I never kiss Artie, Melissa, or any of my school friends. It's so gross to even think about kissing Artie. We met Daddy's friend and they." Jason glanced up from his puzzle. "Charming and Angela is nice. Yes, she is nice," Lynn replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Jason was uninterested in the conversation. He was interrupted and made us hot dogs and mac and cheese. Then he turned back to his puzzle. Beth, however, continued, "Yeah, and she also said we could get ice cream next time, but she and Daddy keep kissing, like you and Daddy used to do. Friends always kiss." Lynn closed her eyes tightly, holding back the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. After a moment, she opened them and forced a smile. "Well, dear, some friends kiss, and some it really depends on the circumstances, but kids your age don't usually kiss their friends, so there's no need to worry about that." "Okay." Beth nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, and returned to her coloring. Now she was drawing a duck that oddly resembled a stegosaurus. Dinner time, Lynn called out, trying to sound cheerful, "Go on, wash your hands." The kids came back to the table where Lynn watched them put ketchup on their burgers and start eating. She managed to hold herself together until they were distracted with their food, then quietly slipped away to her bedroom. Once there, she closed the door behind her and sat down in the chair. By the bed, she buried her face in her hands and finally let the tears flow. The room was silent, save for the sound of her quiet sobs. And so the story ended, leaving behind a sense of quiet resignation and unresolved emotions. Thanks for sticking with me until the end. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Bye.